Creative people often have a sophisticated and delicate nature. At least, it is generally accepted. But what if the circumstances of life were so that instead of brushes and paints, the artist wants to use blood and axe? John Sweeney was born on October 13, 1956, in Kirkcaldy, Great Britain. He grew up in a family with his brother and sister, spent his early years here. Then the family moved and ended up in Skelmersdale. According to some witnesses who knew the Sweeney family well, his father has always been a cruel person. From an early age, John was subjected to his total control. In the case of the slightest disobedience, the man used physical force against the boy. Psychologists later regarded cruel episodes in childhood as a catalyst of problems. And it was they who could make John hated by any form of control. He himself simply copied his father's behavior. One way or another, the family was strong, from the working class. Father taught his sons since childhood to be decisive and persistent, real men. True, for this he used rather cruel methods. Probably, it was father who imposed a model of behavior with women with John in which they should always be below him. Despite the aggressive environment in which the guy grew up, he was always very creative. From childhood, he developed a passion for painting. From the age of 15, John dreamed of going to an art school, but the family did not support his zeal, so the young man studied on a carpenter, mastered the carpentry. The imposition of a profession could also form a constant disappointment in a young man. He simply could not realize his ambitions because he was forced to do otherwise. The hero of the story had problems with the police from an early age. As a teenager, he first showed the ability to extreme forms of violence. This led to several unpleasant incidents. The schoolboy was prone to outbreaks of aggression, cruel behavior, from which peers suffered most. As far as is known, for the first time John provoked a dangerous fight, being a high school student when he bought chips in a trading shop near the house. He was not yet an adult, but already knew how to use an axe that accidentally turned up by the arm. John aggressively waved a dangerous tool. According to witnesses, in this event, no one was affected by a miracle, and an inadequate teenager escaped with a conversation with the police. By 1974, the wayward young man decided to marry. His young wife was a girl named Anne Bremley, with whom he lived in the neighborhood in Skelmersdale. For several years of marriage, they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. But, despite his wife's hopes, John was always cruel, and no changes helped to pacify the character. Especially terrible were its seizures in a state of intoxication. The wife complained that he had repeatedly mocked pets to intimidate Anne, and also threw bricks into the windows during one of the conflicts. At the same time, he caused tangible damage to property. The wife said that he always suspected her of treason, despite the fact that she did not give any reason and remained faithful in marriage. At the same time, John himself was never against getting to know a pretty girl and get an affair on the side. As acquaintances described about a young family, he treated any friends in his life as property. This was experienced by his first wife. Anne described John Sweeney as a sweet and pleasant man, but exactly until he had a mood difference in which he clung to any trifle and became very aggressive and cruel. At such moments, he easily exploded. It seemed that he was ready to come up with a reason if he was not. 5 years later, John's first wife decided to file for divorce. This happened in 1979. But, as is characteristic of manipulators, the man tried in every possible way to convince her to resume relations. Surprisingly, it worked, and the couple got married again in 1981. This was achieved because John kept himself in his hands all this time. The former believed that he had really changed for the better, Of course, he could not hold back endlessly. As soon as the couple officially marry, the wife's aggressive behavior resumed. John Sweeney again became aggressive and uncontrolled more and more often. House violence episodes began to be regular. Before she finally decided to break any relationship, they again had a brutal conflict. One evening, John drank too much and attacked his wife. He was so cruel that he tore the old post-operative scar. Now Anne, bleeding, finally decided to part with him, not going to restore relations anymore. However, as expected to the manipulator, he could not just let his wife, whom he considered his property. John began to behave as a pursuer. Sometime after Anne's move, she was visiting a neighbor. While she was in a neighboring apartment, both women heard a suspicious noise that came through the wall. She decided not to walk and not check on her own what was happening. Anne had suspicions that it could be John, obviously not with good intentions, or robbers could burst into the house. Any of these options seemed dangerous. The woman immediately called the police and entered the house, accompanied by a law enforcement officer who helped to search the apartment. Suddenly, John jumped out of the closet. He was armed with an axe and a knife. He obviously did not expect to face the police and admitted that he was trying to make a surprise for his ex-wife. Anne was sure that he took an axe and a knife for a reason. She believed that the ex-husband was going to kill her because she finally tried to get out of his control. Of course, John was not believed to the version with a surprise, and the man was arrested. But, to great surprise, he was later released without charges, since the man did not harm anyone and was in his apartment. With a man, they simply made an oral promise that he would stay away from his ex-wife. Of course, this was not enough. So as soon as the divorce proceedings were completed, Anne left with the children away from the dangerous husband and hid her location. John finally lagged behind. He decided that it was time to change his life. The man was already under the close attention of the police in Skelmersdale, so he decided to leave this city and go to a tour of Europe. In order for inadequate to be forgotten, he went in search of work abroad, believing that there was more money and opportunities. It turned out that it was not difficult to find temporary work, but for a long time he did not linger anywhere. So John Sweeney visited Germany, France, finally ended up in the Netherlands. During further investigations, it was not possible to confirm any incidents and facts of attacking women during these travels. On these trips, John Sweeney decided to return to his old habits. Therefore, he began to look for a woman with whom he would like to connect herself with the bonds, and so would get a new victim. But here he did not work out, because he decided to return to his homeland. Curious, but in parallel, John returned to his passion and began to draw. Later, specialists in his paintings saw the real person of the criminal. The arts were frightening, incredible, usually bloody, depicting scenes of violence. But at the moment, it was still just peculiar works of art. By 1986, 30-year-old John Sweeney was divorced. He lived far from his family. Here he worked with a tree, interrupted by earnings on repairs and construction sites. The man settled in London and met Melissa Holstead, who was a model and photographer. She invited John for repair on the set. Melissa was a bright and beautiful girl. Apparently, John immediately liked her. The man saw that she was quite vulnerable and perfectly suits as another victim. Melissa was from Ohio, the United States, lived in Europe, in another country, was alone, few talked with anyone, and obviously did not suspect the history of the violence of this person. John immediately turned on all his charm to the maximum. After a couple of visits to the set, he suggested meeting, so romantic relations began between them. At the very beginning, Melissa described the connection as warm and romantic, which very well described the behavior of the criminal. so they gradually began to live together. The unsuspecting victim was trapped. John lasted less than a year before he first attacked his lover. All this time before this period, John gradually undermined her self-esteem. Surrounded by a lie so much that the American was sure that he was in a hopeless situation. She started her career problems. The family, which at that time was in Ohio, saw that it was an unhealthy relationship. Mother and sister kept repeating that she better parted with John as soon as possible. About a year after the start of the relationship, the sister of Melissa came to her in the UK, so she only strengthened in her aversion to John. In the apartment, the sister discovered prohibited substances, saw some of his frightening artwork, and was truly shocked by what she saw. Leaving the lemon balm, her sister begged to part with a man as soon as possible. Nevertheless, the relationship continued. Over the next 12 months, John was again in the field of view of the authorities. In 1987, he made the first attack on his lover, for which problems with the law followed. He was twice a warning for violent actions. In one of them, John threw a chair into Melissa, damaging both legs. Another time, he beat his fist on the face. Nevertheless, both times only received oral reprimands and fines. This was due to the traditional mild attitude to domestic violence, which at that time showed the authorities of Great Britain. By the summer of 1988, John decided to move to Austria. A friend accompanied him everywhere. At that time, it seemed that the changes were beneficial for their relationship. They have a warm connection without violence. Apparently, this was due to the addiction to new place. It was necessary to get a job, find housing, so the outbreaks of aggression were a little faded. Things during this period really went well, both worthy of earned, and even Melissa's model activity went uphill again. She often traveled on business trips as a model. Now they could afford to rent housing in the center of Vienna, but romance was destined to go ashes. One evening, John made himself felt the aggressive character of John. He attacked his girlfriend with a hammer. Finally, he was imprisoned, and Melissa was urgently sent to a hospital with a broken skull. Apparently, here the man saved offense against his lover, and also showed an increased interest in creativity. The paintings became truly terrible. One of the most alarming sketches appeared just in this prison. He drew a bloody image of a man who holds the head of a woman, lifted back, brings a knife above her throat. John sarcastically called this drawing a romantic weekend for two in Austria. Psychologists later evaluated his art. It became obvious that the offender transferred his experiences and cruel life to paper. Unfortunately, nobody paid such attention to John directly during the appearance of these drawings. In fact, these were obvious prerequisites, since the drawings are full of cruelty, violence, and blood. He clearly projected his inflamed mind on the canvas, who wants to kill. While John was in custody, Melissa was restored after an attack. She no longer kept evil on her tormentor and even missed him. This was probably a manifestation of the Stockholm Syndrome, when the victim justifies the behavior of her offender, pitying him. She did not suspect the cruelty and bloody paintings of her man, so she decided to make concessions. In February 1989, the girl appealed to the legal system of Austria, asked the court to pardon John. She had the right to this under the legislation of the country. The appeal worked. The girl took the statement about the attack, and John was released after serving 6 months in custody. The authorities ordered him to leave Austria. Unfortunately, Melissa again accompanied the man. Both hit the road. Now, having traveled 1,000 kilometers, it was time in Amsterdam. Here they lived all of 1989, rented an apartment in the center, worked, used a rented car. The couple lived near the railway station. In November 1989, Melissa called her family in Ohio. There was no one at home. The girl was forced to leave a voice message where she wanted to loved all the best. She said that she loves everyone and wants to meet quickly. Then she again went on a business trip. As her relatives did not try to contact Melissa, after this call, they could not do this for several months because by that time, there were no mobile phones. John also ignored the calls of his family, Melissa. At the end of April, the girl, tired of constant conflicts with John and beatings, decided to break the relationship with him, which she told her work colleagues. She also stated that if something happens to her, John did it, and then she disappeared, and no one else saw her alive. On May 3, 1990, a random passerby noticed a suspicious bag in the Rotterdam Channel. There were parts of the body inside, but without a head and hands. The witness immediately turned to the police. When the remains were discovered, it became obvious that the murder was a severe act of violence. Not even division into parts caused the greatest shock, but the state of what the police managed to detect. The girl had a broken spine, and in half, judging by the condition of the remains. For a long time, she was subjected to tortures aimed precisely at causing maximum pain. After the reprisal, the criminal put the units into a large black bag, in which it was later discovered. Meanwhile, the girl's family was worried because she did not communicate with her for many months, but it was not possible to connect all this. An application for the disappearance of 33-year-old Melissa was submitted in Amsterdam, but another police station acted in Rotterdam. Researchers did not have access to the application. It was not possible to establish the identity of the victim at that time. The investigation was simply closed, and the discovered remains were buried at the Rotterdam Public Cemetery in the nameless grave, without realizing who was in the hands of the police. The murder just got away with the criminal. John did not lose time in vain and returned alone to London by 1991. He did not tell anyone what happened to Melissa. The girl just evaporated. Her relatives suspected that the man did something with her, but there was no evidence against him. Therefore, John continued to calmly enjoy life. The 34-year-old hero met here with a 40-year-old nurse named Delia Balmer in a local pub. They had several random meetings. John, in his usual scheme, turned on all his charm to fall in love with the victim. A short relationship ended that the woman offered to move to her home. She was lonely. John actively helped her in household chores, which managed to win the location of the woman. During this period, he worked as a carpenter and earned well in the manufacture of furniture and interior items. Of course, gradually his behavior began to change. In almost 2 years of relations, by December 1993, Delia finally realized who she had contacted. The man showed himself in all its glory, showed his temper and cruelty. She asked John to leave. He did not even conflict on this basis, and agreed. However, he did not disappear from the life of his beloved. He continued to go to the same shops and bars. They regularly saw each other. Wherever she was, John appeared there, continued to control, pursue, and dominate, even ended up in her apartment. In early May 1994, Delia managed to escape from this nightmare. Together with her friend, she went on a short trip to Europe. When the woman returned, John was furious, as he temporarily lost control of his victim. The man tracked her, tied it to the bed, threatened with a knife and a gun. Breaking to Delhi, he told the story of his previous girl, Melissa. John admitted that he killed her. Then he sat with his body in the apartment for 3 days before dividing into pieces, hid in a bag, and throw it into the channel of another city. Delia was horrified to realize that she became a hostage to a crazy killer. He ordered to obey implicitly, otherwise she was waiting for the same fate as Melissa. The torture of the woman lasted a week. He beat her, raped her many times under the threat of a knife and a pistol. Then, Delia was released. In the summer of 1994, John still continued to live with her in the same apartment. He constantly said that he was going to leave, left, and then returned. This lasted months. He simply tortured her in this way, enjoying the despair of the victim. In July, the woman turned to a special shelter and the police for help, even demonstrated to the authorities the alarming drawings of John Sweeney. The woman was simply replied that this was a joke, and they are trying to intimidate her. Nothing was done. However, the behavior of Delia allowed John to frighten. In early November, the man escaped from the apartment. She took advantage of the chance and changed the castles. When the manipulator discovered this, returning on November 11th, it was just furious. The man still managed to get inside. He attacked Delia, acted very sophisticated. He put his fingers in her throat, threatening to tear his tongue out for the police message. When he pulled out his fingers, they were in the blood. Delia began to cough with blood. The next day, the woman again escaped from the tormentor to the police station. She was accompanied home, but John was nowhere. A day later, another attack occurred. This time, the police were called by the girlfriend of Delia, living in the neighborhood. The officers arrived on time as the man was already from Delia in the apartment. A woman in tears ran out to meet the law enforcement officers. She was horrified. When searching for an apartment in the bathroom, a bag with which a man arrived was found. Inside, there were latex gloves and masks, several ropes, and surgical instruments. The contents resembled the killer's bag, but even now the police ignored the significance of this find. John was arrested and kept in custody for a week, after which they were released, provided that he would go home to his parents in Skelmersdale. They were 300 kilometers from Delhi, and the distance was considered safe. Finally, the next victim thought that she could live calmly. However, on December 22nd, the man violated the condition for the bail, as his lover was again seen at the London house. In the evening hours, Delia subsided the front door to the basement with a brick and was about to go down to remove her bike. She still constantly looked around cautiously, struggled with paranoid thoughts that her tormentor could be somewhere nearby. She thought that the offender was following her and was not mistaken. The woman saw the familiar face of the sadist. Delia was left with him alone. John grabbed the axe and waved. At Delia, there was a knife that she tried to use and cut the attacker's palm. In anger, he grabbed him, hit the woman with a knife, breaking through the lung, then he was injured in the thigh. The stroke of the axe, he cut off her finger and interrupted two more. The woman screamed, raised a bicycle to protect herself from an axe strike, and loud sounds attracted the attention of the neighbors. The man took a baseball bat and attacked John to protect the woman. Having received several weighty blows, the attacker disappeared. Delia was sure that she managed to escape, only due to the fact that she had put up the door and managed to quickly run out into the street. The victim was urgently taken to the hospital with both broken hands, a pair of stab wounds on the body, and fet off his finger, as well as pierced with a lung. She needed several emergency operations, but the surgeons saved her life. Physically, Delia managed to put it on her feet, but psychologically she was completely desperate, completely broken, and simply wanted to die. By this moment, the sadist has so far out of her that the woman was ready for anything, just to stop it. Police pursued John Sweeney. He went on the run. At first, I drove 100 kilometers to Northampton, then ended up in his hometown, after which he disappeared from the field of view of the authorities. Despite the efforts of law enforcement officers, he managed to hide and escape from the UK. Over the next 6 years, he was hiding until by 2000 he finally returned to England. By this moment, John was already 44 years old. However, he did not exhibit a show, used another name. Now his name was John Skyus. As he later managed to find out, he used this technique constantly and very successfully. The man had dozens of pseudonyms. In addition, he skillfully knew how to change his appearance. He really had, as they say, golden hands, because he could easily find work at construction sites, work inconspicuously and hide from the authorities. Here he demonstrated different personalities so as not to give himself out. Returning to his homeland, the hero of the story met 31-year-old Paula Fields. Like the rest of John's victims, she was a lonely and rather vulnerable person. The young woman had problems related to alcohol and prostitution. At the same time, both were from the same area, so John easily managed to make contact with his future victim. Paula grew up and lived on the street, spun all her life as best she could. It is strange that John managed to deceive her, because people of such a warehouse of character should understand people well, distinguish between manipulators and sadists. For them, this is a matter of survival. Nevertheless, John Skyus was a rather professional manipulator to deceive even Paul. As always, their relationship began calmly and romantic. Gradually, the man began to show dissatisfaction on various occasions. Indignation and aggression began to grow. In December, all this reached apotheosis. He made another attack, during which the most terrible bloody fantasies surfaced about dividing the body into parts. He killed Paulu, cut off his head, arms, and legs. All this was placed in separate bags. John Sweeney threw her body into the water channel of London. On February 19, 2001, a bag with parts of Paul's body was discovered by boys who caught fish. They called the police. Having discovered one bag with frightening contents, subsequently 5 more bags with the remains of a woman were found. Now, the DNA determination technology worked much better than during the first reprisal. The woman was identified. They went to a suspicious boyfriend, but it was about Joe Scuzzi. Much later, during the investigation, it was possible to understand that it was John Sweeney who was suspected of such a murder of Lemonbaum and searched for an attack on Dello. Finally, everything began to fall into place. The hero of the story became the most wanted person in the UK. Now the police managed to reach him. During this period, he worked at the construction site in central London. The armed group was sent to his detention. And not in vain. John had a gun and a knife with him. Nevertheless, he managed to calmly arrest him. He did not dare to use weapons and resist many armed police officers. During searches in his apartment, more than 300 works of bloody art and poems were discovered. Here, terrible stories were beaten with divisions of bodies into pieces and monstrous bloody reprisals against women. Moreover, parts of these works were dedicated to Delia, who miraculously suffered a cruel attack, part of Polly, and others. 6 years have passed. Finally, John Sweeney was charged with attempted murder of Delhi. Finally, the woman was able to breathe a sigh of relief. On March 5, 2002, in Old Bail, the criminal received a life imprisonment, but with the right to parole only 9 years later. And taking into account good behavior, he could come out earlier. Delhi did not suit this state of affairs. She was decisively configured, did not forget his terrible attack, and was intended to end this subhuman in jail forever. Investigating the death of Paul, the police ran into a number of obstacles, but the case was moving. 6 years more passed before, in 2008, it was finally managed to compare the DNA of the unidentified sacrifice found in the Rotterdam Channel and identify it as a model Melissa Holstead, so managed to go to John Sweeney. Finally, the words of Delhi, who admitted to the murder, as well as his samples of DNA on the victim's body, helped to connect John with this bloody reprisal. The murder occurred more than 20 years ago. Finally, the family of the deceased recognized the terrible truth. They longed for fair punishment. There were problems with evidence. Then, the defendant decided to use the work of the defendant as judicial evidence. It turned out that several of his drawings were dedicated to the deaths of Melissa, long even before the identification of the body. On one of the drawings, he portrayed the tombstone for her. Of course, only the killer could know many details of the murder. Almost 21 years after the death of Melissa, and 6 after the murder of Paula. Finally, in the Old Bail Court, there were hearings on these cases. On April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John Sweeney was found guilty of both murders in the first degree and received 2 lifelong conclusions. Finally, he was deprived of the right to parole. Now the man is guaranteed to spend the rest of his days behind bars.